The vaccine lottery returns. Joining us on Columbus on the Record this week, Julie Carr-Smythe, State House correspondent for the Associated Press, Terry Casey, Republican strategist, and Desiree Tims of Innovation Ohio. Well, there are signs that the Delta variant is peaking nationally. COVID cases in Ohio, they remain, though, stubbornly high. The two reasons: only half the state's population is vaccinated, and mask wearing is still kind of spotty. Hospitalizations remain high, and unlike at the start of the pandemic, the patients in the hospital are younger. Hospitalizations among those under the age of 50 have increased by nearly 750% in the past 2 months. Nearly all of them are unvaccinated, and experts say younger Ohioans who don't get the shot likely will get COVID.
And when you get it without the protection of a vaccine, there is a very real risk you'll end up in the hospital or even in the obituary pages. The numbers really tell it all. COVID has changed and is now making younger Ohioans who aren't vaccinated very sick.
Governor DeWine is once again using a carrot instead of a stick to get young people vaccinated, in particular those between the ages of 12 and 25. For them, the state will soon offer a scholarship lottery. 5 $100,000 scholarships and 50 $10,000 scholarships for college or job training.
We're going to do about anything that we can do that we think has a chance of working. We think this has a good chance of working. We think it will increase the number of young people who are getting vaccinated. But there's no guarantee in life. And, if you wait until you got a sure shot, you're not going to shoot ever.
Julie Carr-Smythe, we saw that graphic that the hospitalizations for folks under 49 have really spiked up, but he's targeting 12 to 25-year-olds. Why is he particularly targeting basically half of that group?
Well, the governor is very focused on keeping our schools open. I think that it's a pretty common feeling around the state that there are benefits to having schools open beyond even the education piece, the social aspects, the help that it gives to families, the socialization for the kids, and some of the social services that are there, the food programs and the healthcare. So I think that the idea is to maybe get a little bit of energy going within that age group and try to create some bit of a competitive feeling of, hey, have you gotten yours? I've gotten mine. I'm going to try for that, like he did with the original one. But I think that those younger kids are a big piece of his keeping schools open strategy.
Yeah, I have to figure a lot of those folks are procrastinating. The younger folks in particular may not be opposed to the vaccine mandate, but you know how younger folks are. They put off things. They think they're immune. Terry Casey, we've done this before. There was the Vax-A-Million lottery, and that also included scholarships. And there were a couple different studies. They had different results. One, the governor points to, said it worked. It boosted vaccination rates. The other one said, not really. It boosted it at the beginning, then it leveled off again. How do you think this one's going to do, Terry Casey?
Well, it isn't going to solve everything, because I think one of the problems we've had, there's been a lot of mixed messages out there. There's battles on masks versus vaccines. But I think it's important to keep pounding home how vital are the vaccines. And again, I think the state health director made a very good point. I think all of us, one of the reasons why I've got the vaccine and had it back in late February, is I want to avoid the morgue. Nobody wants to be in the obituary pages. And clearly the vaccine provides that protection. So I think we got to get back on pushing the vaccine. And particularly you look at southeastern Ohio as one of the real problem zones in the state of Ohio, because a lot of people think it's only a big city thing, it won't affect them. But clearly the rural areas are where they lag behind the most.
Desiree Tims, there's been a lot of talk about vaccine mandates, mask mandates. Again, the governor, is trying to use science. He's trying to use convincing arguments. Now he's trying to use incentives to get folks vaccinated. Do you think this one will work this time?
Unfortunately, I do not believe another lottery-based system will work to encourage young people to get the shot. What we know is that the American public in general has been subject to disinformation campaigns. It's time to ensure that we have a strong mandate and strong policies in place to encourage young people to get the shot. I'm really thrilled to see a lot of the university presidents step up to ensure that students are getting vaccinated ahead of what's going to be a deadly flu season. And what we need from our governors to take some hints from some of the college presidents to ensure that more young people get the shot. I don't think many are going to be moved by a lottery-based system, unfortunately.
Terry Casey, a lot of the colleges have vaccine mandates already, and this is going to give scholarships to the college age students, high school age students, I guess, if you get, including middle school and high school 12 and up. Are they not doing the same thing, the vaccine mandates that colleges are imposing, and now you have the college scholarship lottery?
Well, I think the publicity on the option of winning a mini lottery is helpful, but again, it's just a matter of over and over. And I think as people see the news stories, particularly people across the country who didn't think they needed the vaccine, and then suddenly they find themselves in the hospital, I think people who are in that desperate circumstance and what they're saying, people need to listen and pay attention to that. But again, I think we're getting back to the vaccine. I think that's the number one thing to push, because that is really the long-term protection that builds up. And of course, we're halfway there now, but we'll be more so pushing booster shots. So I think it's got to be all about the vaccine and reminding people that as we get to the fall and people are inside more, there's more danger if you aren't careful and you aren't vaccinated.
Julie Carr Smythe, there's about a half dozen bills circulating around the State House that would ban mandates, whether they be mask mandates, vaccine mandates, vaccine passports, mRNA vaccines. What's the status of these bills, and are they actually there's a chance of passage?
Well, I think that those bills are being debated, but there are some divisions here. Some Republicans who are in the majority at the State House want to back the governor, but he has seen intensive pushback from fellow Republicans who don't buy into the government's role at all in this. We're seeing it not only here, but around the country, where people are trying to suggest that either the science is flawed, or as Desiree says, there's a lot of misinformation out there that is flowing very successfully through Ohio, and some of our lawmakers are pushing these bills. But the sense is that some of those, for example, the vaccine ban that had come through, or really the lawmakers backed off on that after we were somewhat of an embarrassment with some of the testimony that was portrayed that was given at the State House and then sort of spread around the country as really not based in any kind of factual reality.
Yeah, and the Chamber of Commerce came out against putting restrictions on businesses who want to require their employees to get vaccinated, if that were the business's choice. It's been nearly 2 weeks since Columbus Mayor Andrew Ginther imposed the mask mandate in Columbus. Desiree, what's been your experience? And we'll start with you. Just how are folks complying? Do you see a lot of folks wearing masks when they go to the grocery store, when they're at events?
I think it depends. Typically, what's happening in the news cycle, when people are afraid, you see more people masking up. When people are less afraid, they're feeling a little bit more adventurous. We know that masks work. It's a shame that the Republican supermajority in the State House are entertaining the idea of banning and prohibiting mask mandates, because we know that masks save lives. And it is going to be on the Republican supermajority and some of these very far-right extremist lawmakers when the State House lawn is full of names of babies and children who have succumbed to COVID-19 because of such extreme policies.
Terry, in your travels around the city of Columbus, how's the compliance with the mayor's mask mandate?
A lot of areas people have kind of got the message, but obviously we've seen on TV reports like Nationwide Arena this past weekend, the prime entertainers working the crowd with no mask on, and nobody in the crowd's got a mask on. And I've heard other reports of things, and clearly some people are with it and some people, and again, it's one of these things, a lot of younger people feel they're invincible and they don't have to worry about going to the hospital, the ICU, being on a ventilator. And obviously some of them are misinformed because they're going to get it and find out they got a problem.
All right, let's hope it's the Delta variant has peaked, as it appears to have peaked in other parts of the country, and it's on its way down here in Ohio. Our next topic, round 2 of the state's redistricting process begins soon. Actually, it's likely already underway behind closed doors. This process is a little different than the one that produced state legislative maps last week. Lawmakers have until Thursday to approve new congressional maps, and those maps would require support from half of the legislature's Democrats. In the likely event that does not happen, the process then goes to that redistricting commission. They have until Halloween to get something done. If that doesn't happen, it goes back to the legislature, and if they can't even get modest Democratic support by the end of November, the maps would only last 4 years instead of 10. So did you get all that? Desiree Timms, it's pretty complex, but if legalized betting were here in Ohio, I would put $10 on the table that we're going to end up with 12 Republican seats and 3 Democratic seats. Would you take that bet?
I am an optimist, and so I'm going to continue to be optimistic and hope and pray that our lawmakers follow the will of Ohio voters. Ohioans voted twice for a process that allows for us to have fair maps, and maps that represent the fairness and the proportion of Ohio voters, 45-45%. We've continued to see the way Ohioans have voted statewide, and so I hope that Republicans will do the right thing, find a heart, follow the law, and engage in a process that is fair and true to the voters. Anything outside of that, anything that is extreme, such as a 12-3 process, is going to do more harm than good, because it's going to suppress the voices of the voters as we continue to tell them to participate in our democracy. It's going to go against everything we stand for.
Terry Casey, if we were to go with that 55-45, roughly it would be 8 Republicans, 7 Democratic seats. Do we see that happening?
Well, the problem is people make assumptions based on indexes. And if you go back to 2010, I think there were 5 different Democrat incumbents who thought they were in Democrat-leaning seats, and they suddenly got beat, some of them by big margins. So one of the problems in this whole process is people look at indexes based on past races, and those don't always work out to be exactly so. But clearly, drawing these congressional districts, it's only 15 districts, but it's very complicated because there's some federal court rulings in terms of the number of people, and some districts like Joyce Beatty's going to have to lose people that she now has in her district, and how you keep the racial balances, how you keep the numbers. Each district's going to have to be about 786,000 people. That's a lot of people, and it's hard to make everything compact in the community's whole with that big of a number in only 15 districts.
Julie Carr Smythe, what is the talk at the State House? Do most observers suspect that we're going to have the same scenario play out that we saw with the state legislative district maps, that the Republicans will hold firm, and even if they only have to have a map for 4 years?
Well, I mean, the first piece of talk is that they will miss the September 30th deadline, and that would punt it back to the commission. Notably, the commission was just sued this week over the first 2 maps, the legislative maps. And so the Republicans who voted for it, at least Matt Huffman, the Senate president, who was really at the heart of drawing those legislative maps, has defended the process and said that these are not gerrymandered. But who's to say? Because power is always tempted. That's what gerrymandering is all about. And as Desiree says, the constitutional process does call for representation. I think there's a lot of confusion out there that by drawing the map that would favor that would give Democrats more seats than they have on the map is somehow gerrymandering in the opposite direction. I got the sense of that in an op-ed column that Huffman wrote for the Dispatch. And I don't think that that's exactly what we're talking about. Like Terry says, it's about indexes. It's about how many people are sitting in that district and have been, how many are Democrats? We all know that, maybe we have a Republican living on one side of us and a Democrat on the other side. And, what we're doing is proportionally trying to say as many Ohioans as there are Democrats and Republicans, those guys should have a fair shot.
Desiree Tims, I mean, one scenario is the lawmakers could get enough Democrats to support this and it would last for 10 years. Might Democrats, I'm thinking about the Legislative Black Caucus, support a map that increases the chances for people of color to hold these seats? Right now, there are 2 seats that are held. One was held by Marcia Fudge and one held by Joyce Beatty. Fudge, of course, has moved on to the administration. Might they agree to a map if there was, say, 3 seats in the state that leaned towards an African-American representation, which folks like Joyce Beatty says is very important in Congress?
Well, I can't speak for the Legislative Black Caucus, but I can say in some of the conversations I've had with people, they're interested in seeing a fair process. Democrats are not arguing for the maps to be a hostile takeover of the Democratic Party and for Democrats to have more seats than Republicans. Democrats are arguing for a process that is a part and complies with representational fairness and maps that don't cheat people. I think the message is very simple. Stop cheating us, stop cheating Ohioans out of a fair process. So we want people of color to be represented and to have a voice, but we also want to make sure that we're not packing in as many Black and brown people in one community so that we can have like a token representative. That's not the goal. It's to have a representation, maps that are representationally fair and that we have voices at all levels of government.
Terry Casey, if we end up with another 4-year district congressional maps because it's Republican dominated, what do you think happens next? Do you think advocates go back to the ballot and try to get a stronger reform system approved by voters?
There's a lot of what ifs, but the biggest what if is what's the Ohio Supreme Court going to do now that they've got the state Ohio House and state Senate districts? And an interesting wrinkle is that one of those members of the court, Pat DeWine, is probably going to recuse himself. So Maureen O'Connor, who's very much of a swing vote on this issue, will appoint the justice to fill in for Pat DeWine. So there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of variables. And clearly, as it's going to take the time, at least through Halloween, to do the congressional, we might have some sense out of the Ohio Supreme Court which way they lean, because the difficulty in this constitutional amendment, nobody has perfectly determined what does fair mean, because fair for one person might be different from another. And you did raise a good point, Mike, on Black representation, because right now in Congress, 2 of the 16, 12.5%, are African American representing Ohio, which is just about matching the population. If we went to 3 out of 15, that would be 20%. But there's a lot of variables, a lot of moving parts, including what will the Ohio Supreme Court do in the next month or so.
Okay, the GOP race for U.S. Senate has another official candidate. State Senator Matt Dolan has finished his listening tour, and he says he heard loud and clear that Ohio Republicans want him to run. So he joins the crowded field that includes former Treasurer Josh Mandel, former GOP Chair Jane Timken, and author J.D. Vance, as well as businessmen Mike Gibbons and Bernie Moreno. Terry Casey, Senator Dolan wants to be the, I want to say anti-Trump candidate because he supports many of Donald Trump's policies, but he doesn't want to be the candidate who's falling over himself trying to get the Trump vote. Does he have a chance?
He's got a chance because, number one, he's got some money and means that way, and not in central Ohio, but in northeastern Ohio, which is 38% of the state. His family, because of the connection with the Indians or the Guardians, have some awareness that way. So if you've got money in a field that might be 6 or 8 different candidates, you might be able to win with 25 or 27%. So does he have a chance? Yes, but we've still got a long ways to go to see how many people actually saddle up, file, run, and how much money they're willing to either be able to raise or put into the campaign.
Julie Carr Smythe, that is a question. Can he raise the money? It's a tough leap to go from the state Senate, even if he is a finance committee chair, a powerful position, to go from a state Senate district to a statewide U.S. Senate win.
Right. And I did talk to him the day that he entered the race, and he said he's confident that he has the financial backing as well as the backing of the voters that he needs to do this. So it will remain to be seen, but the large donors in the Republican Party, I think some of them are holding out. You know, everyone wants to see if Donald Trump will endorse in that race, and that could mix things up. What we're seeing with Trump is that he often now is waiting until someone looks like a sure bet before he actually endorses, and so all he has said is he will not endorse Matt Dolan, and maybe that brings some money his way.
Yeah. Desiree Timms, are Democrats rooting for someone like Josh Mandel, who's a real lightning rod, rather than a person like Matt Dolan, who's more of a traditional Republican?
I don't think Democrats are rooting for any of the Republicans right now. We know that the Republican Party is trying to redefine itself. Is it the Donald Trump Republican Party or not? We know that Donald Trump doesn't like Matt Dolan. He probably will be able to raise some of the money. He can probably self-fund the race. We are interested in making sure our candidate right now, who is Tim Ryan and Morgan Harper, who are both running, to have a really solid primary and make the case to voters across Ohio, vote Democrat.
All right, our last topic. Federal Judge Michael Watson says 126 alleged victims of former OSU Dr. Richard Strauss have a very good case. But Judge Watson this week dismissed all of their cases against Ohio State University. Watson said it's, quote, beyond dispute that the plaintiffs suffered abuse in the 1980s and 90s, and OSU officials at the time failed to protect them. But Watson says state law is clear. The statute of limitations ran out long ago, and the state legislature did nothing to change it. OSU has settled with 230 other plaintiffs, and the school says it will pay for counseling and treatment for all of Strauss's victims. Strauss died in 2005. Julie Carr Smythe, the judge was, kind of critical of the legislature for not acting on this. There was some talk of extending the statute of limitations, but they didn't go anywhere. What happened?
Yeah, I think that the situation was that they looked at it as, a case that was going to be too narrow and would impact the ability of would impact the legal landscape by just changing things for one single case. And so I think that it got caught up in some of that kind of debate.
Terry Casey, what is the lesson from this case? Not just this case, but you have the Larry Nassar case at Michigan State. You have abuse cases in schools like Michigan as well. Do you think the days of trying to cover up such things are over?
Well, the good news is the times have changed, but there's a legitimate substantive question of, do you change statute of limitations? Because the governor, to his credit, was willing to look at changing that. I think there was reluctance in the legislature to just carve out a special exemption for Ohio State people and not look at other cases that have happened in the past decades in Ohio. But then there's also, the governor correctly raised the question of, maybe you want to loosen things up criminally so people can be prosecuted, even if it's 10, 20, or 30 years ago. But whether you get into the civil area, and then you get into the whole tort reform of how much of the money, if say Ohio State had written a check like Michigan State for $500 million, how much of that would have actually gone to help the victims versus how much would have gone to the trial lawyers. So there was a lot of interest, a lot of debate, but I think the legislature, there were reasons why they didn't want to go there, because if you do it for one group, why not do it for other groups, including victims of, say, Catholic priests?
Desiree Timms, kids can, if folks abuse as kids, have a long time to bring criminal charges. Should adults have that same benefit?
I think this is about the Ohio Republican State House supermajority refusing to end the statute of limitations on sexual assault cases. We're seeing some really gross things come from Republican candidates like J.D. Vance, who mentioned that sexual assault and rape was an inconvenience We know that we have to make sure that people have justice, that kids feel safe, whether it's at the university level or in the home of a loved one or a neighbor. This is about making sure that we do what's right. And so my hope is that we will come up with a system and a framework that will allow the victims to seek justice and to put some of these predators away.
All right, let's get to our off-the-record parting shots. Desiree, you're up first.
Off the record party shots. Ooh.
What's the score of the Akron
Let's
game
see.
this weekend?
I don't know.
All right. You caught her. You stumped her there. That's all right. Terry Casey, you're up next.
This past week, Andy Douglas, who served 18 years on the Ohio Supreme Court, passed away. I first worked with him in 1984 when he got elected. He was a unique original in terms of always creative, always energetic. And his passing is the end of a unique era because there weren't many on the Supreme Court like him, because he was never boring and never uninterested and always had ideas and creative ways to do things.
Julie Carr Smythe, just a few seconds left. What's your final thought?
Keep your eye on local school board races this season. They are going to be the real lightning rods for culture war arguments that are going to be worth watching.
Yeah, also mask mandates an issue in many of those races. I told you the Indians would become an issue in this campaign. President Trump said he's not going to endorse Matt Dolan, partly because they changed the name from the Indians to the Guardians, that baseball team in Cleveland. That is Columbus on the Record for this week. Check us out online. We are on Facebook. We are on Twitter sometimes. We're also online at wosu.org/COTR, where you can catch every episode on demand. For our crew and for our panel, I'm Mike Thompson. Have a good week.